At 6:14 in the morning on June 19, 1944, Commander David McCampbell sat in the cockpit of his Grumman F6F Hellcat on the deck of the USS Essex, listening to an engine that wasn't running quite right and staring at a radar report that should have made any rational man reach for the abort lever. The engine wasn't catastrophically broken. It wasn't trailing smoke or shedding parts. But it was rough in the way experienced pilots recognize instantly, an uneven vibration that sits just below the threshold of formal grounding, yet well above the threshold of comfort when you're about to fly into the largest carrier battle in naval history. His fuel state was already marginal before the mission had properly begun. The standing order for exactly this situation was clear and issued at fleet level. Aircraft with mechanical issues or low fuel were to return to the carrier immediately. No exceptions. No debate. McCampbell read the radar return one more time. 60-plus Japanese aircraft inbound at high altitude, heading directly for the fleet. He taxied to the catapult anyway. To understand why a decorated commander with the authority to make his own call would deliberately launch a compromised aircraft into a formation of 60 enemy planes instead of following a direct order, you have to understand what June 19, 1944 actually was. This was not a patrol. This was not a skirmish over some forgotten atoll. This was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the moment Japan hurled the last serious remnant of its carrier-based air power at the American fleet in an all-or-nothing attempt to stop the Allied invasion of the Marianas. If the Japanese strike package punched through to the carriers, the Essex, the USS Lexington, and the rest of Task Force 58, they would burn. And if the carriers burned, the Mariana campaign didn't stall. It collapsed. The entire strategic timetable for ending the Pacific War went with it. McCampbell understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent 2 years studying Japanese air tactics. He knew exactly what a 60-aircraft strike package could do to a carrier group if it arrived unopposed. The machine he was flying into that fight had been built for exactly this kind of war. The Hellcat was the Navy's answer to every painful lesson learned in the first 2 years of Pacific combat. Earlier, American pilots flying the Grumman F4F Wildcat had discovered that the Mitsubishi A6M0 was a nightmare in a turning fight, lighter, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots who had been training for carrier warfare since before most Americans could find the Pacific on a map. Wildcat pilots survived by flying defensively, using the thatch weave and every other trick available just to stay alive against an aircraft that outclassed them in a knife fight. The Navy took those lessons, handed them to Grumman, and demanded something different. Not something that could survive a zero. Something that could kill one. What Grumman built was not elegant. The Hellcat was thick, wide, and heavy, built to absorb punishment rather than dance around it. Fully loaded, it outweighed the Zero by thousands of pounds. It would never win a slow-turning contest any more than a truck could outcorner a motorcycle. But the Hellcat was never meant to turn with Zeros. It was designed to survive their gunfire, climb faster at altitude, dive away when necessary, and carry 6.50 caliber machine guns capable of shredding a lightly armored Japanese fighter inside 300 yards. Its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, giving it a top speed the Zero simply could not match above 20,000 feet. It was not a sports car. It was a tank with wings. And McCampbell knew exactly what it could and could not do. What it could not do that morning was promise him a smooth engine note. The roughness he felt climbing away from the Essex was real. The deck crew who flagged it were not wrong. A rough engine is not just an inconvenience, it cascades. It affects power output, fuel burn, climb rate, and eventually your ability to get home. Other pilots listening to the radio traffic understood what the abort order meant. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, knew the fuel numbers. The carrier knew the fuel numbers. Every rational variable pointed in one direction. Back to the deck. Fresh aircraft. Replacement sortie. Proper margins. That was what the book said. That was what a careful man did. But McCampbell was not reckless. That distinction matters. Recklessness is ignoring risk because you do not understand it. What McCampbell did was understand every risk on the table. The rough engine, the marginal fuel, the 60 aircraft, the mathematical near impossibility of one Hellcat disrupting a formation that large, and weigh them against the one risk the abort order did not account for: the formation reaching the fleet unopposed. He was not the only American pilot airborne that morning, but he was the one with the altitude, the position, and the intercept geometry to reach the Japanese strike before it closed on the carriers. Every minute spent turning back toward the Essex was a minute the formation spent getting closer to ships that could not defend themselves from 60 coordinated attackers at once. So McCampbell reached up and turned off his radio. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not emotional defiance. It was calculation. As long as the radio remained on, someone on the Essex would continue transmitting the abort order. And he had already decided which risk mattered more. As long as the abort order kept transmitting, David McCampbell would be forced to either comply or formally refuse, and both options wasted the time and focus he needed for the intercept. So he switched the radio off. With that single movement, the debate ended and the mission began. He pointed his Grumman F6F Hellcat north, pushed the throttle forward against the rough engine's protest, and began climbing towards 60 Japanese aircraft with Roy rushing on his wing, and nothing between that formation and the fleet except altitude, speed, and the cold certainty that what he was about to attempt would be considered insane by any reasonable standard. The Japanese formation did not know he was coming. The fleet did not know what he was doing. And McCampbell, alone at Angels 25 with a coughing engine and fuel for perhaps 30 minutes of hard fighting, had already decided none of that mattered. Before he fired a single round over the Philippine Sea, he had spent 2 years building the knowledge that made this something other than suicide. The difference between throwing your life away and spending it deliberately is the whole story, and it began not in a cockpit but in briefing rooms, bent over captured Japanese manuals and debrief reports written by men who had fought the Mitsubishi A6M0 and survived long enough to explain how. McCampbell was not a reckless daredevil. He was methodical in the way only genuinely dangerous men can afford to be. He understood that the difference between an ace and a statistic is rarely courage or reflexes, but preparation, and preparation meant knowing the enemy's weaknesses better than the enemy knew them himself. Japanese strike formations flew tight and disciplined, organized around a leader who navigated, set speed and altitude, and decided when to attack or withdraw, while the rest followed in precise coordination. That structure made them formidable under normal conditions and vulnerable under one specific condition: when the leader was removed. Kill the aircraft at the front and the formation would not instantly collapse, but it would hesitate, and in aerial combat hesitation is a gap wide enough to drive a Hellcat through before anyone finishes processing what happened. McCampbell also understood the mechanical relationship between the Hellcat and the Zero. The Hellcat would never win a turning contest, so he stopped measuring success by turns. The advantage was vertical. The Hellcat climbed faster above 20,000 feet, dove faster at any altitude, and carried 6.50 caliber machine guns capable of tearing apart the Zero's lightly built airframe at close range. The tactic was brutally simple but demanded nerve against 60 aircraft instead of 6. Climb above the formation, select the lead plane, dive, fire. Pull up before the escorts react, regain altitude, and repeat until the formation breaks or you run out of fuel and ammunition. On paper it was 60-1, the kind of scenario staff officers would quietly label unsurvivable. In reality, he was not attacking 60 aircraft at once, but striking the lead element again and again from altitude against an enemy with no radar control and no way to vector fighters onto a threat that appeared from above and vanished just as quickly. The ratio looked impossible. The geometry was manageable if you had the discipline to keep climbing instead of staying low where numbers eventually overwhelm you. Roy Rushing understood his role perfectly. He stayed high and behind during each firing pass, guarding McCampbell's tail so no escorting Zero could line up a shot while the commander focused forward. It was unglamorous work, but essential. Together they were not 2 aircraft but a system built for one purpose: allowing McCampbell to make repeated firing passes against a formation 10 times their size without dying on the pullout. At 22,000 feet, the Japanese formation spread beneath him like one of the briefing diagrams he had studied for years. He identified the lead aircraft, a Zero at the front of the formation's leading element, rolled the Hellcat inverted, and dove. Those same rounds entering through the rear fuselage would have found an unprotected pilot and ended the fight instantly. But the armor held, and the Hellcat kept flying, the impact shudder running through the airframe like a hammer strike against a steel drum as McCampbell felt the violence of it in his spine and understood in one cold, detached flash how close the margin truly was. Rushing reacted without hesitation, rolling down and firing a disciplined burst that forced the Zero to break away before it could correct its aim, and in that brief crossing of trajectories the system they had built together proved itself under live fire. One man attacking, one man guarding, altitude traded for survival in fractions of seconds. McCampbell did not look back again. Looking back was for men reconsidering their options, and he had already decided that the only direction that mattered was up. He pulled the Hellcat into another climbing spiral, engine still rough, fuel needle edging toward the inevitable, shoulders burning from the accumulated strain of repeated high-G pullouts, and measured the sky above him the way a carpenter measures lumber, calculating how much altitude he could afford to spend on one more pass. Below, the Japanese formation was no longer disciplined geometry, but something closer to agitation, escorts higher and wider now, bombers tighter, the lead element replaced yet again by another pilot who had inherited the most dangerous position in the Pacific without volunteering for it. 5 aircraft were gone, navigation disrupted, timing ruined, and the strike was bleeding minutes it could not recover. And that was the true objective, not glory, not even the kill count, but distance between the fleet and the bombs that had been meant for it. He rolled inverted for what would be his final dive, not because the manuals demanded it and not because courage required it, but because the fuel gauge had made the decision for him. Altitude converted to speed one last time, speed to firing window to destruction, and when the gun spoke again at close range the Zero in his sights disintegrated with the same brutal finality as the others, fragments scattering through the Philippine sunlight while McCampbell pulled up through the debris and felt the engine stumble in protest, as if reminding him that physics, unlike fear, could not be ignored forever. He climbed just high enough to ensure separation, counted the seconds it would take to clear the escorts, and finally pointed the Hellcat south toward the distant shape of the fleet, 6 enemy aircraft falling behind him in widening spirals of smoke and flame, 60 launched and fewer returning, the strike delayed, disordered, and forced to reconsider its purpose. What had begun as a ratio that looked like madness had resolved into something simpler and colder, a sequence of calculated vertical attacks executed with preparation instead of panic, proof that discipline and geometry, applied without hesitation, could bend even impossible odds long enough to matter. 9 aircraft destroyed in a single sortie by a single pilot against a formation of 60 on a fuel state that should have sent him back to the carrier before the engagement began, sounded less like a report and more like a misprint. The intelligence officers asked their questions carefully, the way men do when they are trying to reconcile arithmetic with reality. Headings, altitudes, estimated speeds, ammunition expended, fuel at launch, fuel at recovery. McCampbell answered without drama, reconstructing each pass in the same calm tone he might have used to describe a training exercise, because to him it had not been a miracle. It had been a sequence. Altitude advantage. Leader removed. Formation hesitates. Reset. Repeat. The gun camera film confirmed what the numbers suggested. Aircraft disintegrating under concentrated .50 caliber fire. Escorts arriving seconds too late. The lead element changing again and again as each replacement inherited the most dangerous position in the sky. By the time the film ended, the room had grown quiet in a way that had nothing to do with disbelief and everything to do with understanding. The engagement had not been reckless. It had been methodical to the point of audacity. McCampbell had not defeated 60 aircraft. He had defeated their structure. The strike that morning did not reach the fleet in coordinated strength. Its timing was shattered, its leadership stripped away in the air, its confidence eroded by an attacker that kept appearing from above like a recurring mechanical failure in the sky. What looked like insanity from a distance resolved, under analysis, into disciplined vertical tactics executed with absolute commitment and guarded by a wingman who never broke position when it mattered. When McCampbell finally left the debriefing room, cigarette finished, shoulders aching, engine log updated with fresh damage notes. The story was already spreading across the deck of the carrier, not as a legend yet, but as a lesson. The Hellcat's armor had worked. The doctrine of altitude and repeated diving attacks had worked. Preparation had worked. Courage had been present, certainly. But courage without preparation would have ended in the Philippine Sea as another empty seat at the ready room table. What carried him back across the deck that evening was something colder and more useful than bravado. 2 years of study, a refusal to fight the enemy on the enemy's terms, and the decision, made again and again in the span of 40 brutal minutes, to climb back up when quitting would have been easier. The officers cross-referenced McCampbell's account against Rushing's, then pulled the gun camera footage, then cross-referenced again, because when a number seems impossible, the professional instinct is to search for an error in the arithmetic before accepting the conclusion. There was no error. The film showed 9 distinct firing passes, 9 separate aircraft destroyed, and a Japanese strike that entered the Philippine Sea in tight formation and exited as scattered wreckage and disoriented survivors. 9 kills in a single sortie was not a statistical fluke. It became the highest single sortie total ever recorded by a U.S. Navy pilot in the war. And it had been achieved by a man flying a damaged Grumman F6F Hellcat on the edge of empty fuel after disregarding an abort order he believed no longer fit the situation in the sky. The larger battle, what history would call the Battle of the Philippine Sea, was already tilting into legend. In a single catastrophic day, American naval aviators and anti-aircraft gunners destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft while suffering a fraction of those losses themselves. The imbalance was so extreme that it permanently crippled Japan's carrier-based naval aviation. The carriers that had launched those strikes returned with decks nearly bare and air groups shattered beyond repair. After that day, Japan would never again mount a coordinated, large-scale carrier air offensive against the American fleet. McCampbell's 9 victories were one thread in that vast engagement, but they were the thread woven closest to the carriers. The men on those decks understood exactly what that meant. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally approved McCampbell's Medal of Honor citation. Notably, the citation framed his decision to ignore the abort order not as indiscipline excused by results, but as decisive judgment exercised when events outpaced standing orders. In other words, initiative under fire was not merely tolerated, it was validated. The 9 destroyed aircraft and the intact fleet were argument enough. By war's end, McCampbell had accumulated 34 confirmed aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring U.S. naval aviator of the conflict. He built that record not through theatrics, but through preparation, by refusing to fight the zero where it was strongest and by exploiting altitude, firepower, and structure where it was weakest. The pilots of Air Group 15 absorbed those lessons. Many of them survived because of it. After the war, he returned to a quieter navy and eventually to a quieter life. The Hellcat gave way to jets, then to museum exhibits, then to history itself. The noise of the Philippine Sea faded into archival film and fading memories. He did not often speak about June 19th. Men who have truly tested the limits of endurance rarely do. Today, the Grumman F6F Hellcat hangs in museums as a symbol of industrial power and engineering excellence. But aluminum and rivets alone do not explain what happened over the Philippine Sea. Machines matter. Design matters. Doctrine matters. And sometimes, on a morning when the fuel gauge is nearly empty and the sky is full of enemies, preparation and judgment matter most of all. The thick armor, the 6.50 calibers, the massive Pratt and Whitney engine, the self-sealing tanks that absorbed punishment which would have killed lesser machines. Visitors walk around the Grumman F6F Hellcat and see a weapon built to win, and that assessment is true as far as metal and horsepower are concerned. What they do not see is the morning in June 1944 when David McCampbell took that machine alone into a formation of 60 and returned with 9 confirmed kills, a dead engine, and fuel remaining in quantities better measured in sips than gallons, having helped blunt a strike that might have reached the fleet had he chosen caution over commitment. They do not see the radio switched off to end the debate. They do not see 9 separate dives, each one a deliberate wager placed with preparation instead of bravado. Each pass required altitude converted to speed, speed converted to seconds, seconds converted to destruction, and then the discipline to climb back into the thin air and do it again while the fuel gauge slid toward empty. Museums preserve aluminum. History must preserve judgment. We tell these stories so that McCampbell does not dissolve into the quiet that eventually claims every cockpit and every deck log. Because the men who bend the course of events rarely do so with perfect clarity from higher headquarters. Sometimes they do it in the gap between orders and reality. And the ones who were right when the sky said turn back deserve to be remembered by name.